So a little bit of background. I think that when most research protocols look at children with ASD, and it doesn't matter what they're testing, if they're testing language or they're testing genetics, many studies have a factor that's called linguistic abilities or verbal IQ or something like that. In most cases, when we look into these scores, the verbal scores are usually being a criteria for matching typically developing children and children with autism based on these scores. And when we look at these scores, we find that these scores are usually lexical semantic abilities that stand for very wide linguistic abilities. So what we wanted to check was actually if lexical semantics can predict overall linguistic abilities. And that's what we're going to talk about today. לא שומעים?
לא, בסדר, אבל את המסך צריך לעשות ולהגדיל אותו. שומע? לא יודעת למה? טוב, בוא תעזור. בוא נהיה. פשוט. תנסי, תתחיל לדבר.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Sorry. Okay, so children with ASD, you all know. But language is a core deficit for many individuals with ASD, but the variation between individuals and the variation in linguistic characteristics are very, very wide in this population. Even if we're talking only about high-functioning children, the variation between participants is very big. And when we talk about lexical semantics, we're talking about the meaning of words. And when we mean lexical retrieval, it's a very, very complex process. And it involves many components, such as phonological input and output. I'm good? As you'll see in a minute. So the first thing we did was look at previous studies on lexical semantics in children with ASD. And what we found, like many areas testing children with ASD, is contradicting results. We found some studies that found children with ASD as having intact lexical semantic abilities, and we found some studies that say that they have impaired lexical semantic abilities. These studies varied enormously across participant characteristics, IQ, tasks being tested, and the specific lexical semantic ability that they were testing. So this was very hard to get conclusions from this, but about half of these studies use lexical semantics as a proxy for linguistic abilities and matched ASD children to typically developing controls based on these scores. So what we wanted to see, okay. So what we wanted to see is, first of all, if we take a given group of children with ASD, is lexical semantics impaired in this group of children? And can the semantic component be impaired independently from the syntactic component? Meaning, can lexical semantics predict structural language abilities or not? Sorry. It's not cooperating. Okay, so what we did is we took three models. We took the dual root to reading model, and we took the lexical retrieval model, and we kind of pushed them together because we found that the semantic component is part of both of these models. That means that when we see something as a picture or an object, and we have to name this object, we go through the black root, as you can see. I hope you can see. You can. And you can see the semantic component is right there in the middle. Then if we hear a word and we have to point or we have to say something that corresponds to this word, you can see the orange root, we also go through the semantic component. And when we have to read a word out loud, again, we go through the semantic component. So in fact, most of the things and most of the tests that we give participants go through the semantic component. So what we wanted to do was kind of differentiate the semantic lexicon and test each part of the model with the hope of pinpointing an exact location of impairment if we find one. So what we did, we had 16 tasks that were chosen for their ability to test each part of the model. And by doing error analysis, we were able to differentiate where the impairment was. We had cut-off scores for impaired performance on each one of the tasks, and we did this by testing typically developing children of the same age. The first thing we did was group analysis for each task. We tested what the group of children with ASD were doing. But as you know, variance in ASD is very wide, so the next thing we did was actually look at individual profiles. And we wanted to see if, based on individual profiles, we could come to a conclusion of what was going on in these kids, and whether they were impaired or intact. So this is an example of 6 tasks that tested specifically the semantic lexicon. And as you can see, each one of them tests a wide range of other parts of the model as well. Since it's impossible to have a task that purely tests only the semantic lexicon, we chose tasks in which the additional components tested varied, and then it enabled us to differentiate things in the semantic lexicon. For example, these 6 tasks all test the semantic lexicon. If we see an impairment in all 6 tasks, then we know that most probably the semantic lexicon is impaired. But if we see deficits only in 1 or 2 tasks, it means that the semantic lexicon is most probably intact and we have problems in other places. And because we had a wide range of tasks, we were able to differentiate and see which tasks correlate and where the impairments were coming from. So what we had 38 children with ASD, 34 boys and 4 girls, with varying age, nonverbal IQ, and pragmatic scores. Age, we had children from 8 years old to 17 years old. The truth is we took anyone who was willing to participate and was able to read at a basic level. Nonverbal IQ, we used the Raven's progressive matrices, which is considered a very good test for nonverbal abilities in ASD, but we had quite a few children who did not understand the task itself. And so we had children who were not testable and children who had scores that were age comparable. And we used the CCC as a pragmatic score, and you can see that some of these children came out as having intact pragmatic abilities according to the CCC, but I can tell you from personal experience they all had ASD. There's no question about that. And you can see the cut-up scores as well. So if we look at group scores on lexical semantic tasks, they were actually pretty good, surprisingly. Group performance on most of the lexical semantic tasks was very high. We had just one task that was problematic, that was odd one out words, but we think that most of the participants had a really hard time understanding the task, and that was the problem there. And picture naming, all the participants, including those with low functioning, excelled this task. They just did perfect. You can see that group scores were 91% correct. And this is picture naming, where you would think that kids who have a lexical semantic deficit would have low scores, but that wasn't the case. Most children were able to reach a very high score on this task. Although you can see that the range is very wide. There were children who did 66% correct on picture naming at an age where typically developing children do this task at ceiling levels. So there was variability. In most cases, when we saw difficulties with these tasks, we were able to trace them back to behavioral difficulties. That means that the children were not cooperating. They would always choose the leftmost picture, or they would always choose the rightmost picture. Or they would just give us answers that were not related, trying to be funny, sort of. And that also caused a bit of low scores. But overall, as a group, their lexical semantic scores are pretty high. When we go into the individual profiles, this is, for example, a case study of PE. This child was 10 years old, and he was found as having impaired lexical semantics and impaired syntax. You can see that he had low scores on 3 out of the 5 tasks testing the semantic lexicon, but all errors on the picture naming task were semantic in nature. The two semantic tasks that he was actually able to achieve high scores on, this was a picture word matching task and a homograph reading task. Both involved reading in pictures, and he was able to compensate his semantic deficit on this. But in the other tasks, he had very, very clear lexical semantic deficits. He was making category errors, and it was very, very clear. And you can see that on the other tasks, he's got pretty high scores. But then you can also see that he's got very low syntactic scores. When we looked at the syntactic task, we saw that his errors were both syntactic and semantic. So semantics was also interfering here with syntax, and it was very hard to differentiate between the two. Okay. This is another case study. This is MA. He was also 10 years old. And here you can find that his lexical semantics are intact, but he also has an impaired syntax. He had low scores on one of the semantic tasks, but we didn't see any semantic errors at all on all his performance. And he would not have been able to achieve such high scores on the other semantic tasks if his semantic lexicon was impaired. In both low scores, in the semantic part, we were able to trace back a behavioral pattern, meaning that he just didn't cooperate in these tasks. And when we look at his syntactic scores, we see a very, very clear syntactic deficit that is that looks a lot like DLD, or SLI, as some people know it. He had very high scores on the simple sentence structures and very low scores on sentences that had some kind of movement, usually verb movement or WH movement. So on these sentences, he had a lot of trouble comprehending and predicting these sentences. So when we looked at the individual profiles, no participant was found to have an exclusive semantic deficit. We found quite a lot of participants that had impaired lexical semantics and impaired syntax. We had some that had both intact lexical semantics and intact syntax. And some had intact lexical semantics and impaired syntax. When we look at it, intact lexical semantics and intact syntax, we had 9 children like this. But what this graph doesn't tell us is that most of these children had dyslexia. That means they had reading disabilities that obviously were not here, but out of the 9 children, 8 had dyslexia. So that's a pretty high number. Next, we look at the group that had impaired semantic lexicon and impaired syntax. Of these, 14 had impairment in the semantic lexicon itself, and 3 had impairment in accessing the semantic lexicon, and their errors looked a little different. All of these children had a very wide syntactic impairment, meaning there's something going on that semantics and syntax are probably affecting each other, probably affecting development as well. And as we said, no participant was found to have an exclusive semantic deficit. And the last kind of profile that we found was a syntactic deficit, and of these we found 2 kind of profiles. One was an exclusive syntactic movement impairment. These are children that their scores look exactly like DLD. They showed impaired performance on sentences with syntactic movement. And the second kind of profile that we found was syntactic movement impairment as a result of auditory access. That means only when sentences were presented auditorially, these children had a hard time. If they were asked to read the sentences, or they were giving a picture aid, they were able to compensate on their deficit, and they were able to complete the task. So we asked if lexical semantics is impaired in children with ASD. Some of them are, and it's probably part of a bigger linguistic deficit. Some of them are not, and then we don't know if some of them have no linguistic impairment, while others have lexical semantics intact, but they have a lot of other components that are impaired. And can the semantic component be impaired independently from the semantic component? So it can. We found a dissociation between the syntactic component and the semantic component. But we need a lot more longitudinal studies in order to be able to see if it's a primary, secondary deficit, and how exactly they're affecting each other. And syntactic deficits seem to be very common in this group of children, and further studies are obviously needed in order to establish just how common they are. Our conclusions from this study is, first of all, that during language assessment, we need a variety of tools, and we can't use just one tool to indicate how exactly the language of that participant is. So we need different language abilities as well as different task modalities. That means we need to test pictures and auditorially, and we need to test sentences and words, and we'll get different scores. And our conclusions are that impaired scores on lexical semantic tasks predict impaired structural language abilities, but intact scores on lexical semantic tasks don't. And we have to be very, very careful when we use lexical semantic tasks as a proxy for language.